3 hots and a cot, food and living quarters at Fort Point. Enlisted men's living quarters were cramped, potentially up to 48 men per room when the fort was at full capacity. There were 6 bunk beds to a room, 2 men in each bed, 2 sleeping shifts. There was no privacy, almost no room for personal items, some pegs on the wall for jackets, hats, and gun belts, space for boots under the beds, and 2 benches for putting on boots at the end of each line of bunks. All this was squeezed into quarters measuring approximately 20 by 40 feet. But it would be a mistake to view those quarters with 21st century eyes. Most of us have grown accustomed to more space, a room to call our own, and if not that, at least with only 1 or 2 roommates. In the 19th century, whole families often crowded into the same sleeping room, frequently occupying the same beds. The enlisted men who served at Fort Point came from both rural and urban areas, but most likely grew up sharing beds with siblings and even parents. On top of that, San Francisco in the mid-19th century, as now, was a very expensive place to live. Rents were sky high, and houses were hard to come by. Huge numbers of men had flocked to California for the gold rush. The population of San Francisco had gone in 3 years from about 500 people to almost 35,000 people. First, the miners flooded in. Then the people who would provide goods and services to the miners arrived. It was a seller's market. Housing had not caught up with the demand. Prices were high, wages were low. Given the high cost of living in San Francisco, enlisting in the Army, with the guarantee of food and lodging, any food and lodging, could look pretty good. Some of the officers at Fort Point did have housing outside the fort for themselves and even their wives and children. But on an enlisted man's pay, it was impossible to live off base. Besides, the city was too far away in travel time to make that practical. The food for the enlisted men was bland and repetitive. Their diets mostly consisted of beans, hash, soups, and coffee. Lots of coffee. Soldiers all over the country were drinking gallons of coffee, both to keep them awake and to keep them warm. There were almost no fresh fruit or vegetables on the men's tables in their mess hall. Eggs, dairy products, and sugar were very occasional luxuries. Once in a while, they fished down the road from the fort, from the seawall, or off the pier near today's warming hut. But this hardly provided enough food for a whole garrison. The officers had slightly more varied diets, with more vegetables and different kinds of meat. There was milk for their coffee, and some foods would have been sweetened with sugar. They would have had some dried fruit and nuts and canned fruits and vegetables. It was still meager fare by our modern standards. The officers did have the advantage of larger, more comfortable quarters, with more ample beds that they did not have to share with someone else, a desk and straight-back chair, and even a comfortable chair in which to sit and read. Some of the officers had wives and families who were housed at the Presidio, or in San Francisco who they could visit when they were not on duty. While visiting their families, the officers could eat home-cooked meals with supplies not just from the Army, but also from the markets of the city. The majority of enlisted men did not have families nearby and almost never got leave to go and visit them. They did have occasional passes to go into the city, but getting into the commercial parts of San Francisco could take an hour or 2 each way. The differences in how enlisted men and officers lived, the amount of space and privacy they had, the quality of their uniforms, and the food on their tables was very much in keeping with the cultural standards of the era. Officers were drawn from upper-class families that enjoyed a high standard of living. They could often draw on family money to augment their Army pay and have a more comfortable life. Enlisted men came from poor, working-class families. As little as the soldiers earned, it was still more than many people were making in civilian life during such hard times. The soldiers often had to help support families back home, leaving them no extra cash. So, take a moment to reflect on the wonders of life as we know it today in the United States. Our houses, even on military bases, are equipped with hot and cold running water, indoor plumbing, gas or electric stoves that can cook up food from supermarkets that supply local, national, and even international foods any time of the year. They can talk to their families by phone, with computers, and by visiting them, no matter how far away they live. Even our enlisted personnel in combat zones regularly speak with loved ones at home. Now, if we could just deal with that old problem of housing and food costs that are too high and wages that never seem to stretch quite far enough.